start đi. Rồi, ok. Cái này hết pin rồi.
Có một cái hết pin. Có cần đi lấy hết pin không?
Có bạn nào nhờ xuống nó lễ tân xin cặp pin được?
Lễ tân thì chắc hơi xa để mình chạy.
Vâng, thầy xin đi.
Anh ơi, mình đã quên thay ảnh của em rồi.
Thôi rồi mà, để vừa thấy em bảo.
Ảnh cũ này.
Trên á.
Thấy rồi.
Zip. Extreme đúng không?
Thôi đừng, nếu mà không phải thôi được. Lại sẽ có được không ý?
Sửa đi.
Đây đúng không?
Đánh trên rồi mà đó.
Đúng rồi mà. Vậy thôi, ok, baby ở lỗi trên đấy.
Được.
Đổi mic thành mic này chưa?
Người ta nói được rồi thầy.
Cần cái screen này phải nhìn thấy.
Cảm happy mai bạn.
Admit cho em thích được Zoom với. Tất cả.
Hi Sheila, are you able to hear me? Hello. Hi Sheila, are you able to hear me? Harlan, are you able to hear me? Hello?
Hi, I can hear you. I can hear you. I don't know why she can't hear you.
Oh, okay. I see.
She's on mute, but I don't think. Yeah, she just texted me. She said she can't hear anything.
Oh, I see. So I think it's working for all of our ends except Lan's end, which is.
Okay, wait. Let me call her. Okay.
Yeah.
1 second.
I hear. Hello.
Hello. Okay, great. Now you hear us. Okay, I do apologize if we're starting just a few minutes later because of some small technical issues, but we're really happy and glad to be able to see you guys here today from Fulbright University, Vietnam. My name is Vũ Minh Hoàng. I'm the major coordinator for Vietnam Studies at Fulbright University, Vietnam, and together with Thầy Nguyễn Nam, I believe he's also your friend, we co-founded this speaker series in the fall of 2021, in the fall semester, where we try to bring in great scholars, writers, artists, anyone who does pioneering, cutting-edge work on Vietnam to campus, or sometimes virtually like this, and share their work with our Fulbright community and with anyone who's interested. So I'm just really glad to be able to welcome you today. A lot of people are joining us online, and also a lot of people are joining us in person today. And I'm sorry to the people online, we can't send the great bánh mì to you. But for the people who are here, please feel free to grab yourself a bánh mì. Sorry, we also had some traffic, so they arrived a little late as well. Many apologies for that. Saigon traffic, is very much. I think it is also in the book as well. As one of the. Maybe it was not as bad back in your days, Lan. Okay, so first of all, I just want to, as I do that, I also want to introduce our speakers for today and the topic. So about the speaker, we are really lucky to have Lan Cao, who was born in Saigon, Vietnam, and came to the United States as a refugee in 1975. She graduated from Mount Holyoke College and Yale Law School. She clerked for the legendary Judge Constance Baker Motley of the Southern District of New York. the first African-American female federal judge in the United States. She has taught at Brooklyn Law School, Duke Law School, William and Mary Law School, Michigan Law School, and is currently the Betty Hutton Williams Professor of International Economic Law at Chapman University Fowler School of Law, where she specializes in international business, corporate law, contracts, international law, international human rights, women's rights, and rule of law development and its relationship to culture. Her academic monograph on the rule of law, democracy, and culture was published by Oxford University Press in 2015. She's also the author of the novels Monkey Bridge and The Lotus and The Storm, published by Viking Penguin in 1997 and 2015 respectively, and the co-author with Harlan Margaret Lan Cao of Family in Six Tones, also published by Viking Penguin in 2020. About Harlan, she was born in Williamsburg, Virginia, and moved to Southern California when she was 10. She wrote Family in Six Tones when she was a sophomore in high school. She's currently a student at UCLA, majoring in psychology and entrepreneurship, and is also working on a novel and a film script. She's the executive assistant of Professor Maya Sotero of the Obama Foundation, and she loves to spend time with her German Shepherd rescue dog and her rescue kitten. And you can learn more about the authors at lancaoauthor.com/authors. And so it's truly with really great pleasure that we have this conversation with you today. Welcome to Fulbright University, Vietnam, virtually.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. And so I've read through the book, and I think I have a few questions to start us off with. And I know that our audience will probably add some more questions as we go along. Yes, and do feel free to eat your bánh mì as we do this, because we want to fill your stomachs as well as your souls. That should be our unofficial motto. Okay, so the first thing I want to ask, because this is the Vietnam Studies program here, and the study of Vietnamese-American studies is actually also really important. It's an important part of what we do here as well. In some ways, we don't necessarily have all the best resources yet, but that's one of the areas that we've been developing, and we have some great, especially in terms of literature. We have Dr. Yin Vu here, who's the head of our literature major, and she, I think it's someone you also know, and she's been doing a lot of diasporic literature. So we have a good amount of students and faculty here who are really interested in Vietnamese diasporic literature. So I guess the first thing I wanted to ask is, in what ways do you think your family's experiences, which you write about here, are unique, and in what ways do you think they're representative of the community that you come from, and how do you balance those two aspects, the unique parts and the representative parts?
I think every experience is I don't know why there are two of me in the Zoom.
Yeah, when we go just like where you like to see you, we see my mom for some reason.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I see you, but I see duplicates of me.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. No, it's okay. It's just harder to like concentrate because she's like looking at herself.
Okay. Apologies, I think our IT team is trying to fix that problem. Yeah.
Let me see.
We saw you for a second when you were talking, and then you like moved the window, and then she like filled up the whole screen.
Gotcha.
Okay, well, in any event, what I'm trying to say is that I think every story is going to be unique. So there's always a unique aspect because it's not going to be duplicated by another experience, but it's also representative in the sense that at least with the Vietnamese-Americans here, most people left in 1975 and after. So there's a sense of a suddenness to it that can be startling and very traumatic for the family. So for my experience, I found that it's unique in the sense that I was taken out and I lived with an American family for several months before my parents came. So there's a sense of isolation in some ways that are different than the rest of the experience of the people here. But it's similar in the sense that we're all part of an exodus of people who left after 1975 under various different circumstances. But the commonality is the mass exodus. There seems to be some kind of weird delay. Do you see that, Harlan?
Yeah, I can. When I'm looking at you, it's fine, but then from their perspective, it's like delayed. Because I think
the good thing is we can see your video and we can interact with you really well on our end. I really do apologize about your end and about the camera. I think it's just a technical issue that our team will figure out soon. Thank you. Harlan, do you want to add at all to that? Do you think there's something about your family experiences growing up that's typical of other Vietnamese-American families, other Asian American families, or do you think there's some things that are very unique? I see that there are things like practicing music or things like that seems maybe quite typical, but I'll let you answer that.
I think it's funny because when I was younger and even now, like we always there's like a very big community of Vietnamese near where I grew up. It's like called Little Saigon. It's in Westminster, and a lot of it's like my friends now of this generation are fully Vietnamese because their parents left together in the 70s and they went there, and everyone kind of knows like, oh yeah, like violin and piano is kind of a thing that immigrant, especially Vietnamese immigrant parents try to do. But I think honestly it's more about the discipline, like trying to create like a structure for their kids after they've been displaced to kind of teach them like, okay, the way to get back on your feet and like survive through this American system is you have to practice every day, like one day at a time. It's just about learning. So I think it's more of like a symbolic practice, and that's why it's very common for those types of families. I'd say the reason why I find my experience unique or my family's experience unique is specifically because my mother, I know everyone says this, but my mother is like especially unique, not just from the experiences she had to leave, but the experiences she had to grow up in America when she got here and survive. It ended up giving her a lot of different characteristics that went into her mothering, which I think made our relationship unique. But of course, there's always going to be things you find in common with other children who are from immigrant families, like that discipline aspect and that need to kind of teach them to always persevere, and you can never like skip a day of school, because education for many immigrant parents was key to get back up on their feet. I'd say, but then back to like, sorry, I'm like kind of all over the place, but back to the unique factor, I'd also say because my mother really, really emphasized education, especially more than like most other Vietnamese immigrants I've met in my area at least, and she really went overboard. Like, as you can tell, her entire description you gave of her is just like one success after another and just one accomplishment after another in academics. My upbringing was very, I don't know even what the word is. I guess it was all about, like learning how to articulate yourself, learning how to be worldly, almost to the extent where the Vietnamese part of her really could only be seen, at least for me, through this extreme like discipline and routine that she liked to implement. If that makes sense. I think that's what I'd probably say for that.
I think that's probably, it more than makes sense. I think it may perhaps even be relatable to many of our audience, the experience of Asian parents that are quite overbearing and, or another word is maybe hopeful for your future and very disappointed. I think there was one passage in the book where your GPA dropped from what, 4.0 to like something like close to
It was
a B.
minor. It was like a 3.8 or something. Yeah.
Yeah, so 3 point, like from
yeah,
an A to a
think
B
it's
is not
normal.
okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it's normal for Vietnamese parents, and I get why. Like now that I've gotten older, and my mother and I are a lot closer, which often happens. I find like after kids leave their teenage years, they start to really understand their parents more because they kind of become living on their own, and they don't just see their parents as something like telling them to wake up every morning. Like I think of her more as a friend that I just text whenever I feel like talking, and so I can really understand her better now, which means I can understand a lot of little quirks of immigrant parents, like that grade thing. I think the reason it was so dramatic for her is, I don't know, I think, as I said, like that, she's not used to having something to fall back on. Like when she was in high school, she knew, okay, like the only way, after I just escaped this war, the only way for me to get to my goal is if I work hard and get all A's. But for me, like, because she worked so hard for me, I could get like a B+, and I could still end up probably in the same place she is. She just doesn't grasp that because that was never an option for her. So I think I try to be really understanding of that. Obviously in the book, it seems like, which I'm actually happy that in the book I don't seem that happy about it, because I think it's representative of how 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds feel, and I do want it to like encapsulate what teenage girls go through, especially with immigrant mother.
And I do love how raw and how, how very real the book was and how your voices sort of intertwined. Now, for those of our audience who didn't get a chance to read this book, it's a really wonderful idea of sort of like every chapter, one chapter is written by Lan and one chapter is written by Harlan, and you sort of alternate, and we often, you're not talking about the exact same thing, but sometimes you're sharing different, like a comparable period, I guess, in your respective lives, right? And even though the times are different in terms of the temporal time, but the time in your life, like your youth, your time, it's comparable in some ways. Obviously not fully comparable because Harlan is now only 21 years old. So of course Lan has more of her life to share. And I wonder, I'm sure that this book might be different if it was written some years later or some years earlier or in a different way, especially Lan, you write a lot and you have a lot of memories of family and of your mother in Vietnam. Do you think that you could have written a book like this with your mother? Is there something special also about your relationship with Harlan that made this particular approach work?
Oh, well, that's a fascinating question. I don't think I would have been able to write the book with my mother, because we have a very, very different relationship, my mother and I. It's not a relationship that's really based on communication, in the sense of communication being a back and forth, a simultaneous back and forth. I don't know actually if and my mother and I, for our generation, I would say had a pretty open relationship compared to relationships of mother-daughters of a similar generation. Mine was pretty open with my mother, but I don't think we would have been able to write a book where there is that kind of point counterpoint. it would have been a book that basically is just her writing and then my writing that somehow are stitched together. Having said that, you know, the way Harlan and I wrote it, we also wrote our own separate sections and then we stitched them together. But I feel like my relationship with Harlan is a lot more of an echo with each other than my relationship with my mother, because my mother was very much, you know, ranked as a mother. There's a lot of emphasis, much more than my relationship with Harlan. There's much more emphasis on ranking. Like, you know, she's higher ranking, and although she was willing to listen to me, ultimately the relationship flowed more one way, you know, from top down. There was much less of sort of a bottom up interest, really. So if we had written a book, I think we could have done it, but it would be a very different book. And it wouldn't have been, I don't think I would really want to be, I don't think that I would be able to say things that Harlan was able to say in the book. Because it would just be deemed inappropriate.
Yeah, and I kind of get that feeling a bit as well from your descriptions of your family. In many ways, again, I think it is very relatable, I think, for many of our audience here. Harlan, how do you think about, you know, your relationship with your mother? Obviously, you share a lot, and you share very, you know, in a way that I think a lot of teenagers would not, you know, American teenagers, right, really would not be able to share this sort of thing and be able to communicate in such a way with their own parents. I mean, it's not just that communication between mother and daughter may be difficult or may be limited in certain ways in Vietnamese culture, but I think it's also limited in certain ways in American culture as well, right? So what do you think was so special about this relationship that made it possible on your end?
I was muted, sorry. I would say, just addressing what you said about how Western American relationships are limited, and also the Vietnamese with the mother and daughter. I think that the difference there is because for the Vietnamese, the reason it's limited is because of that respect aspect, from what I know and from what my mother's told me of that ranking. I think she even said in a prior interview, she even said, like, she wouldn't even know how to say, like, no, I'm not going to do that to her parents. Like, she couldn't even come up with, like, the vocabulary in Vietnamese for it, because it's just not culturally right. I think the reason why it's limited, though, in American culture isn't because of this respect, because as you know, like, the American teenager stereotype is considered to be quite disrespectful towards parents. But I think it's limited on that end, just because there's not a culture of closeness as much here. It's not normal on either side to talk about things. The reason why I find that, ironically, my relationship with my Vietnamese mother is closer than any American relationship or Vietnamese relationship I've seen is because it's something I can't even explain, because it's not even, like, tangible, but ever since I was a baby, or even in the womb before I was born, you know, she would play the piano for me, and then right when I got out of the womb, she would put my whole body on the piano and play her music for me. So from the minute I opened my eyes, like, she's the best friend immediately. Like, it's like the umbilical cord was not cut for a very long time. Obviously it was cut, but, like, I slept in her bed until I was 10, which from what she told me is culturally, like somewhat normal a lot for Vietnamese. You know how a lot of generations live in the same house together, so it might be normal for the kid to stay there. But in terms of, like, the verbal communication that made us super close, I think being an only child helped. And I think for her, when she was growing up, because she had other siblings and her mom had things to manage outside of the house, and, like, a bunch of people that worked for the family that were kind of working under her, it was different. Like, she had more opportunity to be distant, whereas with my mother, like, it was work, and Harlan, work and Harlan a lot of the time. And work and Harlan kind of were related, like work for Harlan, and for herself, obviously, but she was always thinking about like, what can I leave for her? What example can I set for her? So it was super personal, just the whole way the relationship was set up. And then also because my father was very academic, I learned a lot about how to think really analytically. So I noticed that from a young age, possibly also from being an only child and the closeness, I was very involved in like family discussions and family dynamic. Like I picked up pretty fast when I was little, problems each parent had, things like that. So it became like a friendship, like things that you would not expect a daughter to know, about her parents, especially probably Vietnamese culture. It's probably not that normal for the kid to know all the details about like the mom's issues and all the details about the father's issues and things like that. But just knowing that already kind of brings you up to that friend level, which is why it was easier for me to do this. And of course, like before we did it, we talked in a very close conversation about it, and just having to do it in and of itself, it's like an emotional, like peeling off the Band-Aid really fast. So even just preparing for it, it's like there's that conversation brings out things that you've never said to the person before. So it's not like this book is going to be anything. Like it's not like it's the first time she read any of this. A lot of it she already knows how I feel because I was a very outspoken child. So I was always telling her how I felt in a way that probably shocked her because it was probably would be considered disrespectful in Vietnamese culture. But as I said, because of all those factors, it was normal for me.
Yeah, and you almost kind of take my next question out of my mouth because I mean honestly you're only 21 now. When you wrote this, you were a sophomore in high school, and the writing I think shows actually a lot more maturity than I'd really often expect for someone of that age. You're the same age, by the way, as many of our students here at Fulbright University, Vietnam. So I want, obviously there's been some distance between the writing and also the publishing of the book, right? It's a process that got you here. Maybe you could share something in terms of tips, in terms of share something about that experience as a writer, as a published writer, with our many young writers here. How do you find that process? What should they look out for as someone who's just gone through that process?
Well, I do want to say that writing a memoir is definitely very different because there's like the vulnerability factor of it, and knowing that what you're writing is not about a character you made up, but it's about yourself. So it's basically like trying to make a diary very appealing to the public. So that's one difference. But I think in all sorts of writing, it really depends on the personality. I find that often certain people like to isolate themselves. They shouldn't look at other work because they don't want to be like too influenced, or they don't. But other people, I find, especially like social ones, it's good if you go to, like my mom even taught me this before. Like you go to museums. She doesn't read other books while she's writing, and neither do I. I personally don't read other books. But before I start the process, I definitely do. And I try to pick up, like, when I read other books, like what I really like, what I don't like. For example, when I was really little, I knew, like, okay, I hate books that are just super flowery, but like say nothing. So I really watch out for that when I'm doing it, but I still don't want to kind of be too much like Hemingway, where it's just like a bullet, a bullet, a bullet, a bullet, and it's, so you want to have some sort of descriptors, but you just find your style, and you can do that through different things. You can start with a short story first. You can practice. Poetry is also really helpful to find your rhythm. And then, I'd say like look at a lot of art, like watch movies where the dialogue really strikes you and feel your characters. And then if you're writing a novel, for example, or something, anything that involves like a lot of human relationships, you really want to think about like the motives behind each character, what drives them, and make sure that the way you feel about the character is shown in the way you're writing it. Because I would realize when I was writing, oh, like what I just wrote made a lot of sense. And then my mom would read it and she'd be like, and this is the same for all my school essays. She'd be like, this makes no sense. You're all over the place. The thoughts are everywhere. And like that can be great sometimes, but if that's not your goal, then you really want to be clear. It's hard because to explain this, because the process that I did, because I was super self-conscious of the fact that it was a memoir, I would never reread my work, which is really helpful for me. Like if you're a self-conscious person, that's great. Like not to reread it and overthink it. But my mom does the opposite. Like she looks back and she will like edit each thing and really ponder over each line. I would literally write it one time emotionally and then leave it. But that was okay to me because my character, I wanted to seem emotional. I wanted it to be representative of girls my age. So I was okay with looking emotional in my writing. So if you're doing characters based on that, I would say, let's say you have a character that's really logical and really put together, then you can really take your writing while you're writing that person cautiously so that the style kind of reflects the person and the reader can feel the person. But if you have like, let's say you're writing about like this really neurotic woman who's kind of frantic all the time, it's okay. I think it'd be great to just write and then not look back because it'll seem the way she is. So it's just things like that, like finding little tricks and styles and taking your weaknesses as a writer and putting it into something really good and unique for the character. And in terms of like the publishing part of it, I don't really, are you asking like tips to get into publishing or like how to put the book together?
No, I don't think quite to, well, perhaps, I guess just, because you're a first time published author, right? Of I guess, semi-fiction, not really, I guess it's more nonfiction in a way, right? I guess I just wanted to ask what a young writer feels about this whole process that's just been out, because again you say that okay, a lot of what you write is very emotional. It's almost like method writing, right? It's like the actors that do method acting, right, where they try to fully immerse into the character that they're playing, and what you're suggesting is almost like method writing, where like if you're going to be this character who's super emotional and super colorful, then you should write like that as well, right? I guess as someone who's been through that, but then still also has to wait some years, right, as this whole sort of publishing process happens, and maybe you could just give us a bit of insight into that process, I guess, because at some point, editing does happen, and a lot of this structuring does happen, right?
As a young person in writing, it's especially daunting because I started working right with this nonfiction department of Viking Penguin Random House, and it's obviously like a lot of editors who have been working there for a very long time, and I perceived that as like, oh, they're going to have a very critical eye. And so just being like 17, 18, 19, 20, and you're having like all these meetings with people in their 50s and 60s who have published like incredible works, it's definitely hard to like maintain confidence. But I had to remember the whole time, like, okay, like you're doing it for a reason. Like, obviously, like it's good enough if you're here for a reason. So the confidence factor is huge. And also because to be a young person this generation, where I find that like books are kind of dwindling for us, for kids my age at least, it's like a big deal if someone reads. That I found like a little bit discouraging, but not to the extent where I didn't want to do it. It kind of like fueled me even more. The editing process is really interesting because there's lots of different, obviously there's like line editing, like the grammar and all the boring stuff. But what I found really interesting was we hired two different types of editors. We hired one that kind of, you could correct me, Mom, I think it was two different ones. There was one that would make sure that everything someone said kind of made sense. Because as I said, my writing was super emotional. So I would mention something and forgot I had. And then they would say later, like, this story doesn't add up to before, so you have to switch it. It's very detail oriented, even to the extent where like my mom told me when she was writing Monkey Bridge that she wrote like a scene like in one chapter where the moon was like a half moon, and then the editor literally like wrote to her and said, okay, well, like the next chapter after that you say that the moon is full or something. That's not possible in that time frame, like very particular. And then there's a different type where the editor kind of reads it and talks about like the overall, as kind of what I was saying before, like how what you feel about the character needs to be represented on the page correctly to the audience. So this other editor would kind of make suggestions about like, oh, I really think that you need to include like a whole page of dialogue here to really drive this character home, like suggestions like that, which I found super helpful, which made all of that intimidating part worth it for me. But I personally, I don't know why, but I was a very like know-it-all teenager. So like when someone gave me a suggestion, I was like, I don't like, no, you just don't understand my character. Like you don't understand the direction I'm taking here. So I would resist, of course, but my mom would like come to me and she'd be like, no, like we hired this person. She's very qualified. Like you're going to do it. And I want to see it by Friday. And she'd push me and I did it. And we'd go back and forth for a long time. And that period before it gets published is very angsty for me, especially because COVID hit. So like we had this book tour we were going to do in person. And because I became really introverted during COVID. So when that was canceled, I'm not going to lie, like I kind of felt a little relieved, but also disappointed because I felt like due to my young age in the book, having a book tour in person would be really good to clarify some things I said. Like it would be nice for my 20-year-old self to look back and be like, no, my 18-year-old self actually meant this. But I realized like it doesn't matter so much because it's supposed to be representative. So there's a lot of mixed feelings behind editing and everything. But at the end of the day, I think all the teamwork behind it is really, really important. And you don't see that when you read books. You don't really think about all that.
And honestly, that is a very self-interested question on my part as a teacher here, because I want to make sure my students understand that a lot of editing must happen for every piece of writing, and really drive that point home. Now, Lan, I think what Harlan shared is of no surprise to me. You are an impressive woman. Like you are a impressive legal scholar, a lawyer yourself, right? You have published novels on your own, and I am so totally not surprised that you that you help educate your daughter through something like that, and you have obviously raised a very, very impressive daughter yourself. Now, I also find that you've brought a lot of your legal knowledge and your legal sort of worldview into the book. I mean, not least just in the structure of it, right? It feels a lot like a courtroom, right? One person, Your Honor, my side, Your Honor, let me present my side, so on, right? So I see that legal influence. You also bring, I guess, sometimes a very, very specific, like nerdy legal references into this very sort of heartfelt, personal sharing, right? So there's huge changes in tone, right? How do you manage that? Do you ever worry that, about those transitions and about being, I guess, nerdy, or I guess it's being nerdy just sort of being yourself then, and nothing to worry about?
Being nerdy is just being myself. So because I am very nerdy, but let me, before I transition into that, and I want to mention something that I want to piggyback on something Harlan said. So she was referring to a copy. There are copy editors, and then there are the editors who acquired our books. We didn't hire any of them, they because you use the word hiring. So I just want to make sure that it's not like we hired separate editors. We did not have that. We just had, they're all Viking editors. They're not independent editors is my point. So we did have two editors who were our main editors, meaning the editors who would work with us on content as well as style. One is Terizia, who started out as an assistant to our primary editor, but now she's her own associate editor. So what's interesting, and then there's the copy editor who would meticulously go through, let's say, even more than the prior two editors, spelling, grammar, and also like making sure that references are consistent and that they're logical, like some of them would check on dates, like, for example, I remember on some pages, I would write like Tân Sơn Nhất Airport. And then sometimes it would be Tân Sơn Nhất, NHAT rather than NHUT. And somebody would catch that and make it consistent, right? So that would be the copy editor. But what's interesting about the editorial process is that unlike other works of art, let's say you're a painter, right? If you're a painter, you basically just paint and then your product is done. You do not have somebody who goes in there and say to you, I think that you need to add 4 more flowers in your painting. Whereas in writing, you do. The relationship between the editor and the writer is actually very close. And sometimes you feel like, when I'm writing at least, especially in my novel, because my editor with my novel, Monkey Bridge, I met her in 1997. And then the next book, I had her, again, as my editor. When I'm writing, I'm very aware of her being with me. So it's almost as if she's sitting on my shoulder. The relationship between the writer and the editor, if you've worked with them before, they are very present while you're doing it. And they can make suggestions like, I think you should add this, I think you should add that, in a way that I don't think is that actually does not take place. Like a music composer has nobody telling them you should add this or you should add that or you should remove it. Same with artists, but that's the unique relationship in writing, where the editor is just really a part of the writing and the editing process. A very intimate relationship, almost sometimes like another author, if you have a very good relationship with your editor. With respect to your question, and so I transition daily, actually, between being a creative writer and being a legal writer, because since I'm teaching law, I do also publish in law, and I publish a law review article. I would say, once a year, or at least work on one once a year. And they're very long articles. They're about 60, 70 pages, single space, published. And that taps into a very different part of my life, the part that is more logical, more rational, and more research-driven, where every statement requires a footnote to support that statement. And then, so that sort of thing to me is very rational, very literal, right? It's data oriented because it's research oriented. I'm not making anything up when I'm writing a law review article. But when I'm doing my other writing, creative writing, I do sort of burst out of that more data-driven shell. And I don't do any research when I write creatively. And that's the appeal of it. I like that. To me, that's more like a dreamscape, right? Because you can never research your dream. I mean, you never know what you're going to be dreaming about. You don't decide what you dream about. And that to me is more like the creative writing process. I just let it go out and come in however it happens, is free flowing. And because of the subject matter I'm interested in, which is the subject matter of, war or immigration, that sort of subject matter, it feels very much like, as I might have mentioned before, a poem by a very famous poet named Adrienne Rich. She has a poem called Diving into the Wreck. It's about a scuba diver who goes down and look at shipwrecks. So in my other writing, which is not legal, I am interested in shipwrecks, shipwrecks of countries, shipwrecks of personal life. And that's what drives me. So I'm always navigating between the data part and then the more personal shipwreck part. It's two different styles of writing.
I think you're kind of dangling the carrot here for an academic like myself, like a historian. The dream of getting to write smoothly without footnotes. Oh my God. you might get me to write a novel after all. So I guess one last one from me before opening it up to sort of a broader audience. And this one, I should say, trigger warning, sexual violence for those who maybe want to leave the room or shut off your Zoom sound or something in a second, because and I will say that the book should have that is something in the book, right? Harlan, you wrote very candidly about your very personal experiences with sexual violence. This was, I think, a very brave thing for you to do, and so publicly, right, at a young age. Can you tell me more about how you began by telling your mother about this and your family, and I guess that's also a mark of the relationship you have, right? That's maybe not going to be true for every, especially for Asian mother-daughter relationships. Lan, can you maybe share about how you reacted to this story and how you guys sort of together decided to share something like this in the book?
Oh God. It was very long ago for me. I was 14. I was 14. Sorry, it was a very loaded question, so I'm trying to think about how to answer it. I did not tell her when it first happened. It was not like the rest of our relationship, which is super reactive. She and I have a very reactive relationship where one of us feels something and we would spend so much time together where you just say it immediately. Like you'd be like, I did not like what you just said. This happened to me today at school. I mean, she knew all the drama going on at school for me, even like fun drama, like with girls. Like I'd be like, you'll never believe what happened with so-and-so. And she would follow everything. But for this, I think the reason I did not tell her, I don't even remember if I talk about this in the book, but it's because I did not register it for what it was when it first happened. And I think this is something that happens to a lot of girls and boys. For one, I don't think I wanted to recognize what it was, because when you do that, whether or not you want to do it, you place yourself in a victim situation. And at an age where you're already feeling insecure, I did not want another thing to make me feel like, and I wasn't as confident at the time. So I think I was worried that I would put another thing on myself to make me dislike myself. So I didn't even really tell myself to even tell my mom. I felt something off after it happened, like a shift inside, like this crossing of like resentment and feeling like, I don't even know how to use it. Like this word of like feeling like I'm not a baby anymore, because 14 still is a baby age. You're not really responsible for much, even though you think you are. So I felt a big shift. And then I don't really remember when I told her. I think it might have been, she probably might remember, but it was a while after. Like it could possibly have been like 2 or 3 years after. And I think it even came out in like a different fight about something else. And I never sat her down and was like, Mommy, like this happened to me. Because another issue is I knew that my mother is as much as I would hate like the discipline a lot, at least it applied to the rest of the world. Like if someone ever hurt me, it would be over. So I don't think she would ever be okay with me being like, this happened, but I really don't want to do anything about it, which is something that I never thought I would do. Because when you're like 13 to like 16, 17, especially in the news with a lot of like the Me Too movement and everything, I always thought as a kid, which was stupid of me, like who wouldn't say something? Like, why wouldn't you? And it's like, it's so complicated, the psychology behind it, especially because I knew the kid really well, which was the reason it was so shocking. It was not a stranger, which it hardly ever is. And the reason for saying it in the book, I actually got a lot of resistance from the publishing house. It's not like they said like, no, you can't, but they would kind of try to put little like warnings, like we recommend like maybe you shouldn't. But I just thought like my mom talked about being bullied in high school, and readers who are like intelligent readers can read it and see like that's a moment for her where she crosses over and like new survival tactics kick in. I just felt like I owed it to myself, since I did not really hold him accountable. I thought it was important to at least make something out of it and have girls and boys read it and feel like, okay, this can happen in all forms. It doesn't mean like a knife to your throat sort of situation like we see a lot of the time, like dramatized in pop culture. It could be anything, and it doesn't mean you're not invalid, like to think that it happened to you just because it didn't happen the way you thought it might, or just because like it wasn't super forced and it's someone you trusted. It doesn't mean that it's your fault at all, because these are all feelings that I had when I was younger about it. So I just felt like by saying it might, and like speaking up in that way, since I didn't speak up about it conventionally when it happened, I thought maybe it would do something, or at least make someone feel less alone. And I really wasn't that self-conscious about it when I did write about it, because my mom taught me to be someone that self-reflects. And it was really important for me to mark that as a event that caused a switch in me, even if I didn't want it to. I became like much less trusting. And a big part of the book is to also talk about how like parenting style of the Vietnamese immigrant mixed with being a high schooler in America, how those two converging ideologies can affect like the kid's relationship with her peers, like how she treats relationships. Because you're just talking about like that law, like arguing style. Even being raised by a mother like that, it's like I'm dating someone now, and he even said like you're so argumentative, even if you don't mean to. Everything you say, you're always like, and this is how I know, and I back it up with an example. So there's just a lot of like influence from my mom and everything. Do you want to answer it, Mommy?
Well, I know that she did not tell me the very moment it happened. And as she said, it could be because she herself didn't even name it until much later. And then she told me. We did have a disagreement over how we're going to handle it. Because I think Harlan was very worried that I would make a fuss, and that would create more attention onto her when she was not totally ready yet, right? Is that correct, Harlan? Am I representing this correctly? Yeah. So when I heard about it, when she told me, I was very interested, and I think I was very forceful in my goal, which is we need to get out of this, or we need to talk to the administration about this as well. And I immediately removed her from the school. This is like right in the middle of 10th grade. So, I didn't want to create a situation where something happened. It's not just in sexual assault, but I feel like in any time that you're being violated, and it could be just as an individual, it could be because of your ethnicity, your race, your religion, anything like that. I think that one should, it's important to speak up and not allow it to continue. And some of it is maybe an overcorrection for me, because when it happened in my own high school, nothing happened, right? Because I got no remedy from that. So maybe I overcompensate when it happened to Harlan, but we took care of it. I mean, I went to the administration, we removed her from the school, put her in a different school. And when Harlan wrote about it, I wasn't sure if it was a good idea to write about it. And as Harlan said, the editors were very cautious because she was a minor, and she was 15 or 16, and they were very concerned that they not be indirectly or unconsciously pushing her to maybe sensationalize something that she may later, when she's an adult, regret having written it down. So they were not the ones that, because sometimes editors may say, oh, play that up, because that's a very big conflict. Play it up. They were great. They did not say don't do it, but they were very careful. They said, are you sure you're comfortable doing it? And do not feel it has to be included, because they were more of a restraining force. And then, of course, towards the end, we also had a lawyer. The general counsel of the publishing house also came in and talked to us to make sure that there would be no possibility, let's say, of libel or defamation if that particular person objects to it. So some of it we did couch, we made it a little bit less identifiable in case there are legal issues that came up. And that was actually the same with my math teacher who bullied me. I had to also, I didn't provide his name in the book. I gave him an alias, and I smoothed out the edges a little bit, so that, because he's still alive, the last time I checked. I mean, I actually check him pretty regularly to see what's happening with him. So, when you're published by a major publisher, there's a lot of layers that you're dealing with besides the two people you work with closest. And the two people we work with closest were our two editors, who were the acquiring editors. And then you have other people that are also part of the team.
Yeah, thank you so much for being so forthright, both in sharing your story and then also in sharing how you dealt with it with us, because I think that's such an valuable insight, both into the book itself. I think you're probably going to have a lot more fans after, and I hope so, after this talk, but also just for other people who may be struggling with these issues, or who may want to write in relation to these issues. I think that was very, very powerful. Thanks for doing that. Okay, so I just want to open things up to the audience, both online and in person. Online people, please feel free to raise your virtual hands, or just type your question into the chat box as well. That's another way you could do it. And anyone in person who wants to ask any questions, please feel free to do so at this time. Okay. And please, just give your name also. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, Harlan and Harley. My name is Anne, and I would like to ask both of you a question. So in the book that you guys have written, can you share what was your most favorite part or chapter that you're still very interested until now? And if possible, can you please share the context behind that specific chapter or cutscene or part?
Mom, you go first. I need to think.
You know, I actually don't, I'm embarrassed to say, I actually don't remember a lot of the books anymore. But I meaning like this chapter or that chapter, but I do know that, hold on a minute, that my view is a little bit strange. I can talk about the theme because I remember more the macro than the micro. I know that I talked about the two things that are the most impactful in my life. One is leaving Vietnam, and the second one is giving birth. So one is sort of like a leaving, and one is an entering. So the leaving I remember very vividly because it turned out to be very traumatic. I think I became a different person because of the experience of being forced in some ways to leave. You know, because you're born with a certain personality, I would think. And it's a mix of nature and nurture. So your nature can be one way, but the surrounding environment can certainly be like a billiard ball that changes your direction. So you know, like when I was in Vietnam, my personality was very much kind of like happy-go-lucky. My favorite word that I use with Harlan, lackadaisical. I'll be like, well, that's good enough. That I think that is actually my personality when I was in Vietnam, because I remember incidents where I didn't particularly do well. I didn't really care about it in school. And then the collision of 1975 with my personality changed me completely, because now in America, I'm like a different person. And I don't think it's just from the normal transition of age. I don't think that my change is due to simply normal biological evolution. I think it's caused by like a meteor striking planet Earth, you know, for me. So I'm not lackadaisical. I'm always thinking of plan A, plan B, plan C. What if this doesn't work? And so that part of the book, which is the impact of leaving and how it changes you, is something that is important that I included in the book, because because I wanted to convey that it's not just a geographical move. It's not like I was in Vietnam and then now I'm in America. You know, it's just like you transplant a tree. It takes a long time for that tree to take root and to flower again, and it becomes a different tree, even though it's the same tree, but in a different soil. It's actually a different tree. So that part of the book, I'm glad I focused on and tried to convey. And the second part, you know, giving birth is very powerful, because I remember, and the part of the book that I do remember writing about this, I'm very glad I included, because I remember, you know, how your body changes as a mother. The moment the moment the baby is conceived, and how the whole body changes, you know, in preparation to carry the child, right? So I remember my whole body changes. It's more swollen. I'm hungry all the time when I hardly ever think about food. And then when the child is birthed, you're nursing the child. And I remember the moment when I started to supplement the breast milk with just regular food because, you know, the child is older. I remember feeling very sad, actually. That moment, I remember, wow, this is the beginning of the separation, right? Because I've had her for 9 months. Her entire nurturing food comes from your body. You nurse her, everything comes from the body, and now suddenly you're adding a different nutrient. And then you're slowly weaning the child away from nursing, right? And everything changes. Your whole body changes when you stop nursing. So you see how the child at one point was totally dependent on you for food, even oxygen with the umbilical cord. And then it's just the beginning of the child becoming a separate being, which the child, of course, is a separate being. So those are the two things that I am glad to emphasize in the book, the two events, the departure and the entry. Go ahead, Harlan. I have a very strange view.
Well, it's not so much a whole chapter, but my father passed away in the middle of the writing. He knew about the book deal, which I'm happy about, but he died when I was 15. So I had kind of just started to get an idea of what I was going to write about. And I really resisted writing about him. I mentioned him here and there, but I do not give him his full due for his influence on me, because there was like a period of like 3 years where if I even like thought about him more than 10 seconds, like I'd have a breakdown. So I couldn't write about it as much. But there's a scene like in the beginning where I think I talk about like the concept of feeling someone after they're dead, and feeling like his watch on me, like little things that each person has their own version of this, like for their mom, like little things that remind them of her or the dad. So that was very important to me to write about. And the second part that I'd say is still like present today for me, there's a part of it that I used to get into college, because obviously like it's super competitive. So I really mentioned like this book as my main project throughout high school, and they want you to kind of include this excerpt of your writing, or like if you're an artist, like of your art. So there's a scene I think that I wrote about a doctor's visit and about kind of like being a hypochondriac, like you think you're sick when you're not sick. So I had this like time in my life where I'd go thinking I had cancer all the time. I don't know why I did that. I think I was just like a worrier, because my mom worried a lot about different things. So I kind of like picked it up because we're always together. So I would always be thinking like, oh, I just coughed, like I guess I'm dying, like that type of attitude. So I would always be at the doctor's office, and I included like this dialogue, and it was my first experience publishing dialogue, because I actually really want to go into film, which is all scripts and only dialogue. So I loved writing that. I loved writing the dialogue. So it's this scene where I'm like interacting with the doctor, and it seems really simple, but I included it in all of my college applications, and I kind of related it to like mental health and like the link between like the mother's habits with the child's habits, things like that, because I ended up being a psychology major, so it fit. Yeah, that was like definitely my favorite, and it still sticks with me.
Thank you so much for that sharing. Other questions?
I see something on the chat.
Oh, why don't we
Where,
see
Mom?
it?
In the chat, there's a question.
Oh, wow. IT, can you show the question, please, on the chat? Yeah. Oh, maybe it's a private message. Yeah, maybe you could.
At the bottom, can you see the chat?
No, Mom, I don't see any questions.
So it may have been a private
In the chat.
question to.
I know. What does it say? Because we can't see it.
Yeah,
I see it.
Yeah, maybe you can just answer that one, Lan.
Yeah. So this is about the politics of representation. Which is a great question. In the diaspora, the Vietnamese who are outside of Vietnam and who grew up in the United States, how do we represent ourselves? And in many ways, right? I wrote Monkey Bridge, and it was published very early in 1997, I think, and it was probably one of the first, if not the first book by a mainstream publisher about Vietnam or about the war that is not written by somebody like an American vet. And I wanted to do that. because I saw that a lot of books about Vietnam had been written by Americans, and Vietnam was like an American experience. And for me, what am I considering when I write about this topic? On the one hand, I do not want to overplay and make so central the war. That has always been my concern. So having said that, however, it's hard for me to escape the war because the war has been so defining for me. So when I write about the war, I also want to include, as in Monkey Bridge, a lot of the non-war stuff, just growing up, Vietnamese culture, Vietnamese tradition, Tet, what we eat, bánh chưng, things like that, to not make it be totally defined by the war, because in many ways, the American interest, at least in the 90s, with respect to Vietnam is really only about the war, because it's how Americans know Vietnam. So they're only interested in Vietnam because of their relationship to it, which is through a war lens. So I try to broaden the perspective when I write about Vietnam and not just include war. But when I do write about the war, it is very important for me to not write the war as if it were an American possession. So that is the politics of representation as well. And I find that for the diaspora, what's ironic is that Americans know much more about the war from, let's say, the perspective of North Vietnam than the perspective of South Vietnam, because all of the documents that were held in South Vietnam are not available to Americans. Whereas when they do research on Vietnam and they go to Vietnam, there are a lot of documents about the war that are written from Hanoi. So I'm also very interested in representing the war from multiple perspectives, and not from an ideological perspective, just from a human perspective. With respect to politics of representation generally, the question becomes, how much do you translate, right? When you write about a minority experience, it doesn't have to be Vietnam. It could be anything. Like one of my favorite writers is an Indian-American writer, Bharati Mukherjee, right? Which you reference in the question. And she said, if you write about something that is not familiar to the Americans, make it just familiar, like don't exoticize it. But if you write about something very familiar to Americans, like Thanksgiving, maybe make it be very exotic. So you flip it. So the question for me has always been, let's say I write about something that is about Vietnamese culture. Do I just write it as if there's nothing to explain, or do I want to translate? So that's an individual choice. I tend to translate because I'm interested in creating a communication bridge. So I don't want to just make it harder for the reader to, of course, the reader can go look it up, but that could interrupt the flow. So sometimes I add a little bit more translation than another would. But in terms of representation, it's ironic for me to say this because I write so much about Vietnam, but I actually don't like national representations. I am much more of an internationalist. So when I write about Vietnam, it's really just a vehicle, because this is where I'm from, right? So you have an Indian writer who writes about India, but it's not like I must be loyal to the Indian perspective, or I must be loyal to the Vietnamese perspective, or the South Vietnamese perspective. I don't think that writers have to be loyal to a particular national representation, because it's art. And sometimes you can provoke it. So not only am I not tied to national identity, generally speaking, even though I do write as a Vietnamese and I'm interested in the Vietnamese experience, I'm not interested in the authentic, what's the pure Vietnamese experience? Do we have to represent us in a good way? Do you owe allegiance to represent something in a way that is going to make you look good. No, I don't believe in any of that. So both from the fact that I'm not a nationalist, to the fact that I don't think that from the perspective of a writer, I wouldn't think that a writer would want to do that. So my representation is very sort of artistic and unorthodox. I don't feel that I have a duty to represent any particular group any particular way. Because I think identity is messy and is hybrid, is fractured, is ambiguous. And I don't think that making it clear and pure is what I'm interested in. I don't know, does that answer your question? How?
Oh, it wasn't my question, but I think it was a really, really excellent answer. Yes. Oh,
How,
yeah.
boy, I think
Oh, Tao.
that was
Okay.
the one.
Oh, how? Okay, thanks. All right, from Hoa, yeah.
Hi, I'm Hoa. Okay, so I excuse me because I haven't had chance to read all of your book, but I'm really curious about because you have this book is the third book of you, right? Like the first book is Monkey Bridge, the second is The Lotus and The Storm, and this is the third book. So you write a lot about Vietnam, and I'm curious about the evolution of your writing. How does each book tell a different story about your refugee experience? And may I ask if you have any plan for the next book about Vietnam? And can you share a little bit about it with us?
My first book, Monkey Bridge, I never even expected to publish it. I was just writing it because I was very upset when I read so many books about Vietnam. At the time I started reading books about Vietnam in high school, and I was upset at how there were so few Vietnamese in those books. And my book was particularly focused on the immigration experience, right? So it was more, how does somebody start out as an immigrant and become an American? So it's more like a immigration experience, which is very universal to America because there are many immigrants in the US. So from that perspective, it's a very typical immigrant universal experience. You know, the Italians have gone through it, the Jews, the Germans, the Irish, they've all gone through a process by which they shed some of their immigrant identity and then struggle with how much to shed, how much to keep. What is the meaning of the melting pot? Is there even a melting pot, right? Those are the issues in Monkey Bridge. It just happened to be set against the context of Vietnam. Then with The Lotus and the Storm, I was more interested in, I was actually more interested in the experience of the war as told by a South Vietnamese soldier. So it's not about the immigration experience per se, but it's about the relationship between the US and South Vietnam as expressed through a particular soldier. And the reason why I wrote that book actually was that I was very upset by what's happening at the time with what the US was doing in Iraq. And I saw the foreign policy of the US replicating from one country to the next, right? And my sense is that American foreign policy is one in which the United States decides whenever it wishes to enter a country. Oh, we're going to enter Iraq. Oh, we're going to enter Vietnam. And then in the process, I even use the imagery, a wrecking ball, right? It's going to do whatever it does. And it's like unleash a war, support a war, have a wrecking ball all over that country, and then just decide, well, no, we've had enough. Now we're going to do this. So that entitlement of we go in, we go out whenever we feel like it, which is happening, consistently, almost like as a pattern. I was upset by that, and that's what motivated me to write The Lotus and the Storm, because I started writing it like around 2013 or so, when the US was struggling with what it's going to do in Iraq. And I decided I'm going to use Vietnam to illustrate what was happening in Iraq. I don't think I will be writing about Vietnam anymore. I'm working on a book. It's a collection of short stories, but it's set in Cuba. And so, it still deals with some very similar issues, because the Cubans and the Vietnamese diaspora are quite similar. Many Cubans also fled when Castro came. So there's a exploration of the relationship between the market versus the planned economy. And then there's the issue of the church, the Catholic Church, which is very dominant in Cuba. And also there's a very strong presence of the Catholic Church in Vietnam. So that's what I'm interested in, but I'm not using Vietnam anymore. I'm using Cuba. I have a lot of Cuban friends, and I feel like I know a lot about Cuba just from knowing them.
Yeah, and I think as an internationalist myself, that will be a really important book, because white writers are usually very confident to write about any country they like, but a lot of like Vietnamese writers are going to be really nervous about writing about countries that are not Vietnam or I guess America, right? So I think that there'll be something. I'm sure I speak for a lot of people to say that we look forward to a lot. I wonder if we have time to just answer very quickly the last. So there's one last question in the meeting chat, I guess we haven't heard from Harlan for a little while, so if you want to take this one first, or generally.
It's actually about the mother language, so you should take it, Harlan. See it?
Yeah. Well, he also asked if there are any moments where you feel something is better expressed in Vietnamese or this one, so you can take that part. Or one affects the way you express in the other one, so you can also take that part. But I would say in terms of the role of Vietnamese as the mom's native language, in the writing, I think, interestingly, because I grew up around a lot of Vietnamese music, which is very poetic compared to American music. It's like sometimes she would translate things for me, or I would have to listen to music, and then she'd want me, this goes back to the whole like academic thing, she'd want me to memorize the whole song and then recite it back to her like as we're going to sleep, to make sure like I really was absorbing this Vietnamese culture. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And there was like one, and she would pick one about like a mother's love for her baby, so it was like kind of like to bond us even more and bond me back to like my heritage. I'm answering, Mom.
Right, but you're referring to the song Lòng Mẹ, which is a very beautiful song, which I would teach, not because it's Lòng Mẹ.
Okay, well, she would teach it to me, and she'd want me to sing it back to her, is the point I'm saying. So it's very like, and I would usually know what most of it meant. And I went to Vietnamese school for a while after we moved here. And even when I was living in Saigon for a summer, like a part of a summer when I was little, I'm just exposed, like even the way that the sentence moves, it places different importance on different subjects of the sentence than Americans, right? Like my mom even explained this to me when I was younger, about how even the fact that there are different ways to say things based on the ranking of the person in your life or who they are relative to you, it's not about so much about you, but about your environment. Like who you are relative to the person you're speaking to. It's not just about you in the sentence, versus in America, like the I is capitalized to show importance on like first person. So even just learning that and being exposed to that that's probably why in the writing there's a lot of like back and forth. Like I'm not just sharing about my experience, but I'm always saying like, well, even though I feel this way, I'm sure she felt that way. Like a lot of reflection on the other person and letting that reflection influence you. And I think that shows a lot in the writing, even though it's separate. And also because being exposed to that language, which is symbolically like very, in my opinion, compared to English, super flowery and poetic, but at the same time, like, I prefer that way. So I think that's why in my writing, there's a lot of symbolism. Like I even put people in terms of like animals. I don't know if you read about that, but even like people I didn't really like, I'd put them in a characteristic of an animal that I found to be like kind of vicious as a way to cope, because a lot of music and a lot of writing and things I'd hear in Vietnamese would relate a lot to like nature metaphors and things like that. It's very like, it's not just about the human being or just about you. It's like you, the person next to you, your sister, your mom, how that affects everything, the world around you, the rock and the rain and like everything like that. So it definitely influenced my writing a lot.
Well, with respect to the Vietnamese language, I have often, of course I write in English and my Vietnamese is not that good, but I do understand Vietnamese. I understand it better than I speak it, because I left when I was 13 and never proceeded with my Vietnamese education. So my vocabulary, stopped at age 13. And it's a very vernacular vocabulary. So, however, I've noticed that sometimes when I write, in English, I stick with the sort of the rhythm of the Vietnamese language. And because Vietnamese language is tonal, and English is not tonal. Nonetheless, when I write an English sentence, I feel like I want to add a musicality to it. And I'm sure that comes from my native language being Vietnamese. And sometimes I will take I would say something in Vietnamese on purpose, and I would translate it into English, even though I don't need to do that. I think better in English. And my writing naturally is English directly without any translation. But when it suits me, when I want to make a point, when I want to break up the flow of a particular passage in writing, I will do the translation. Because I also speak French, I will sometimes write in French, and then translate it into English, just to create a different syntax, a different rhythm. And it looks original in English because it's been translated, but the person who reads it doesn't necessarily know that. So I do that a lot, actually. Not write directly English, but not write directly in English all the time, but think about it in one language and translate it into English. So I would use a Vietnamese imagery and translate it into English, let's say.
Well, I know for a fact many of my students do that for their essays, write in Vietnamese and then translate into English. But I wish they did it so well that the reader is not able to even tell as you do. Anyway, this is a truly fascinating sharing. I'm really so impressed, so so happy that you took the time to write this book, first of all, and then also to share with us, even though it is pretty late night time, I believe, for you. Are you both in California, I guess, or not?
Yeah.
Not yeah. yeah. So anyway, thank you so very much for doing that. I know that our students will definitely go back and not just look at Family in Six Tones, but also your other books as well, and looking very much forward to the things that you produce very soon. The new book on Cuban Americans, and Harlan, I mean, who knows what's gonna come out of your mind in the next few years, so many years ahead. So yes, so, thank you so much for spending this time. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for having us.
Great to have to share our time with you. Thank you very much.
Take care, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Have a good evening. Have a good morning. Bye. Or afternoon, I guess. Bye.